As we have covered in previous videos, Cincinnati was served by 5 different passenger stations prior to the opening of Union Terminal in 1933. Some 15 railroads delivered passengers to these stations. By the 1920s, most of these 15 railroads were consolidated into the 7 founding roads of the Union Terminal. 4 railroads, the Pennsylvania, the Big Four, which is part of the New York Central System, the Chesapeake in Ohio, and the Baltimore in Ohio, outright owned or was the majority owner of the 5 terminals. The Pennsylvania Railroad had the distinction of owning 2 of these terminals, Pennsylvania Station at Pearl and Butler Streets, and through its control of the Cincinnati, Lebanon, and Northern Railroad and the Norfolk and Western, the station at Court and Broadway. The other roads, such as the Cincinnati Southern and the Louisville and Nashville, would pay rent for the use of the terminal facilities. Now, we must also note that certain roads, such as the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, along with the Southern and the Louisville and Nashville, not to mention the Baltimore in Ohio and the Chesapeake in Ohio, were rivals, sometimes very bitter rivals, in the case of the Pennsy and New York Central, for the same traffic. Thus, the concept of equal ownership of Cincinnati Union Terminal by the 7 railroads and payments of operating expenses based upon actual usage of the terminal facilities by individual railroads was the compromise needed to move the project forward. The beauty of this arrangement from a financial perspective was that no one railroad owned the terminal. Cincinnati Union Terminal was a separate legal entity owned equally by the 7 railroads. What this means is that each of the participating railroads did not have to disclose the bonded debt of the terminal on the balance sheet of their railroad, thus improving their operating ratios. This creative use of an accounting principle is now called off-balance sheet financing and is used to make an organization look healthier than it actually is. On December 29, 1927, the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company filed an application with the Interstate Commerce Commission requesting permission to build the proposed passenger terminal in the city of Cincinnati. The application stated that the terminal company represented the 7 steam railroads entering Cincinnati in the project. The railroads, the terminal stated, were the Pennsylvania, Baltimore and Ohio, Louisville and Nashville, Norfolk and Western, the Southern System, the Big Four, which is a subsidiary of the New York Central, and the Chesapeake in Ohio. The initial proposed amount of some $31 million would later increase substantially as various other projects, such as the Western Hills Viaduct, filling in the rail yard basin, relocation of the Southern Railroad Yard, and other issues that I described in earlier videos in this series were identified. Now, if you're wondering why the Interstate Commerce Commission was involved in the construction of Cincinnati Union Terminal, the reason is simple. The passage of the Transportation Act of 1920, commonly known as the Esch-Cummins Act, empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to, amongst other things, regulate the railroads, which included rate setting, return on investment, and require financial operations of the railroad in the public interest. This would require the ICC to approve large acquisitions and abandonment of railroad assets and provide oversight concerning the issuance of equity and debt. The addition of a large railroad station in Cincinnati and the resulting associated $31.5 million debt clearly required the prior approval of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The financing plan for the terminal called for the issuance by the Cincinnati Union Terminal Company of $3.5 million in common stock, which would be owned in equal shares by the 7 railroads, and for an issue of $3 million of preferred stock, which would be sold to local Cincinnati businessmen and companies. Just as an aside, this preferred stock, which paid a fixed dividend of 5%, somewhat generous for the day, was exempt from both federal and state taxation. This preferred stock would be issued and traded on the Cincinnati Stock Exchange. Yes, Cincinnati indeed had its own stock exchange from 1885 to 1995, located in the Dixie Terminal building downtown on 4th Street. Much of this initial $6.5 million of capital would be used to finance the necessary acquisition of real estate, site preparation, relocation of the Southern Railway Yard, and the construction of the equally critical Western Hills Viaduct. This was supplemented by some initial short-term borrowing of $15 million during the earliest stages of the construction. The balance of the necessary funds to complete the capital stack would be procured by an issuance of $25 million in bonds, which the participating railroads would guarantee. Acquisition of the much-needed real estate for the project was completed, and the fill and grading work for the site began in August of 1929, with the Southern Railroad taking possession of its new yard in June of 1930. The final cost of the project was well over $41 million. As we all know, nothing good ever happens in Cincinnati without someone objecting. And it was a big objection that dragged on from 1929 to the literal start of constructing the actual terminal building in early 1931. At issue was the transfer of land between railroads. As mentioned in earlier videos of this series, the Cincinnati Union Terminal was built upon the former Southern Railway Yard. The Southern, not wanting to relocate to any great distance from their existing rail yard, preferred to build upon adjacent property, some of which was owned by the Chesapeake and Ohio of Indiana, the Big Four, and the Baltimore and Ohio. By 1931, a compromise of sorts was reached, whereby the new Southern Railway yards were shifted to the west of Union Terminal. And once again, we have to go into another detour to explain the story more fully. Complicating the matter was the fact that the Southern didn't actually own the rail property involved. The City of Cincinnati did, owing to the fact that the city actually built and owned the rails and land of the Cincinnati Southern, which in turn was leased by the City of Cincinnati to the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad, which was later acquired by the Southern Railway System in the 1890s as part of a long-term lease. One can only imagine the amount of legal work and billable attorney hours involved to accomplish this little detail. With that aside, now let's get back to our story. Work on the actual terminal began in the spring of 1931 with the expectation that the terminal would be in operation before October 1933. In October of 1930, a mortgage on the terminal project was placed to secure a $46.6 million bond issue issued by the Guarantee Trust Company of New York as trustees for the bondholders. The plan was to issue bonds in stages, generally referred to as Series A, B, and C, as needed as construction of the terminal progressed. This was done to minimize the interest costs during the construction phase, a not unusual process at the time. The first series of bond, called Series A, amounting to $12 million, paying an interest rate of 4.5%, was issued in July 1930. Some $3 million of the bond proceeds was earmarked for repayment of the issuance of preferred stock held primarily by local stockholders and traded on the Cincinnati Stock Exchange. The Series A bonds would mature and be fully paid off by July 1 of 2020. In July 1931, another $12 million in bonds paying 5% interest, called Series B, were issued jointly by underwriters J.P. Morgan & Company and the firm of Kuhn, Loeb Co., both of New York, to finance the next stage of construction. This series of bonds would also be paid off by July of 2020. The bonded debt of the terminal company now stood at $24 million, not including the various short-term borrowings. It took the underwriters until late November 1931 to successfully sell the entire issue as economic conditions in the United States continued to worsen. It is important to note that both the A and B series of bonds, as well as subsequent series, were considered to be of the highest quality, since they were guaranteed unconditionally as to interest and principal jointly and individually by the 7 railroads, regardless of the earnings of the actual terminal itself. In November 1931, a dispute arose between the terminal company directors and the Morgan and Kuhn Loeb firms regarding certain bond terms, specifically the callability of bonds. The calling of a bond allows the issuing entity, in this case Union Terminal, to call or refinance the debt on a stated date at a fixed price. The terminal wanted a shorter call period. The Morgan and Kuhn Loeb firms wanted a longer term. At this point, a total of $30.2 million had been spent or contractually committed on the construction of the terminal, with an estimated $13.8 million needed to complete the project. One can only assume that the rationale for the dispute was that the directors of the Union Terminal, for the most part men representing the 7 railroads, were betting that in a few years they could refinance the terminal debt at a lower rate. By May 1932, the economy of the United States was in a complete freefall, with unemployment reaching 24% and 798 banks in the United States having failed since the previous summer. As work on the terminal continued, the terminal company needed to issue another series of bonds, called Series C, to pay the contractors to complete the terminal project. This series of bonds could find no buyers. The Morgan and Kuhn Loeb firms were no longer able to place the bonded debt in the nearly frozen mid-1932 credit market. According to internal files, the board of directors of the terminal requested Chief Engineer Henry Waite in May 1932 to determine if the terminal construction could be halted until the economic downturn had run its course. This clearly was at the request of the sponsoring railroads, who were already in dire financial straits as the Depression deepened. Waite replied that the construction contracts had already been let, material had been purchased, and in many cases had already been delivered. He went on to state that the labor costs could potentially be saved in the short term, but that lawsuits and legal damages would likely outweigh any such savings. At this point, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation stepped in, purchasing $11.4 million of the Series C bonds for a discounted price of $10.4 million in the summer of 1932. The bonds carried an interest rate of 5%. This would allow the terminal to be completed on a timely basis. It's interesting to note that virtually all of the sponsoring 7 railroads were recipients themselves of Reconstruction Finance Corporation loans at this point in time or shortly thereafter. Eventually, the C series of bonds were finally sold to the public in January 1933, and the loan to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was repaid in full. Why such a quick payback? Perhaps with a new Roosevelt administration taking office in a few months, there was hope for a quick rebound in the economy, and bond investors felt more confident to jump back in the market. Just a word of explanation here. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a federal government agency created by Congress and signed into law by President Herbert Hoover in January 1932 in response to the banking crisis and economic collapse of the Great Depression. Its primary purpose was to restore public confidence in the financial system by providing loans to banks, railroads, and mortgage associations, and other large businesses. The July 1932 loan by the RFC would allow the timely completion of the terminal. In May 1936, as recovery efforts in the United States were underway, the terminal was able to refinance $24 million of this bonded debt with a much reduced interest rate of 3.5%. The railroads were paying some $300,000 a month to the terminal for expenses, $200,000 of which was for interest on the construction bonds. It is important to note that the terminal was financed with $46.6 million of bonded debt and only $3.5 million of equity in the form of stock owned by the railroads themselves. The effects upon the railroads participating in the Cincinnati Union Terminal project was profound. Each of the roads, the Pennsylvania, Baltimore and Ohio, Louisville and Nashville, Norfolk and Western, the Southern System, the Big Four, the subsidiary of the New York Central, and the Chesapeake and Ohio, were individually liable for the debts of the terminal. They were all collectively on the hook for their proportionate share of the operating expenses of the terminal, which included the bond payments to investors. There was immense pressure to operate the terminal and facilities as cheaply as possible. Eventually, when better times emerged, the terminal bonds were completely refinanced with much lower interest rates and shorter durations, with the bond payments ending by 1974, based upon the collective creditworthiness of the 7 backing railroads. However, the terminal did carry a bonded debt of $11.1 million until the advent of Amtrak in 1971. Of course, by then the original 7 railroads had been reduced to just 4, the Penn Central, Chessie, L&N, and the Norfolk and Western. I hope you enjoyed this program. If you like this type of content, hit the thumbs up button below and share our videos with your friends. It helps the channel out. And please hit the subscribe button to be notified of new videos on our channel. We'd like to thank the Cincinnati Railroad Club and its members for the support in making these videos and our channel possible. Until we meet next time on the High Iron, stay safe out there.